Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Wara by Paul Stephani. The day was hot, and the shade from the large green trees did little to cool them. Sweat poured down Eno's face like rain, and his tired legs cried out for rest. They would not rest, though, not until the sun finally fell out of the sky. The group was large enough for safety, though there had been more before. If numbers high enough existed, there would be about 100 of them marching through the land. Since the last moon had been rebirthed, they walked south, leading the valley they lived in during the winter. The winds were beginning to freeze, and soon the north would be white and dead. There were about 50 others that were no longer with them. Large spotted cats and bears would come in the night and carry them off to be eaten. Long lizards and snakes would lay in plain sight, only to strike with fangs filled with venom. There was no going back for the injured. Going back would only mean more death, as well as stopping for too long. They would rest for the night and leave when it was light. The elderly that could no longer go on were left behind as well, so they trekked on in hope of the bounty of the Southland. Of course they made weapons. Spears made of hardwood and rocks broken into sharp blades were a staple for their hunting trips. However, these were usually poor substitutes for simply running and hoping you were not the one unlucky enough to be taken. Occasionally they would find other nomads, sometimes a single person, other times a whole herd. People would join, trade, or mate for a time, and then would be on their way once again. Affection was a foreign concept and would also mean death. There was only one thing that truly mattered in this harsh world: survival. Eno could still remember his mother, just barely though, the way she held him and shone her teeth when she expressed joy. So much time had passed since then, but he remembered the night the Wara got her. It was a night of no moon, and everyone slept with foolish peace. Eno's eyes snapped open when he heard the screams and saw a great shadow biting down on his mother's leg. The dark liquid poured out of her wounds as it dragged her off, and he could see her fear-stricken eyes with terror. As she reached her hand to his, Eno reached out his own, but rough hands picked him up, and they began moving away from her. She was pulled into the thick brush, and the last thing he heard was her shrill screams begin to fill with bubbles. And then there was nothing. He kept his eyes closed until the sun began to show its face, and he stared into the eyes of his father. He found he did miss her, but he survived, and that was all that mattered. Eno walked with his father and the group's leader, Braun, in the front row now. The trees and brush began to thin down, and while it was still hot, he could finally feel the merciful breeze whisk away the excessive moisture that beaded down his pronounced forehead. His long hair was a boon when white covered the land. The tangled mop held in heat like nothing else. However, it was brutal in the summer. He had a friend, Surt, who had once tried to cut his hair. However, the stone slipped, and he only succeeded in slicing open his skin. It became hot and fetid, and eventually he fell into forever sleep, as if some great spirit knew what he wanted most at that moment. He began to hear the sound of a waterfall. Ahead of them was a long, winding river that came from a mountain in the distance. He and the other young men and women of his group began to laugh and get excited. "Be calm," Bron yelled gruffly, giving a sharp look back, which seemed to rest on Eno. "We still have much to go. If we are happy to see water, others will be too. Do not let your guard down." And with that, he turned forward again and began moving forward. This didn't break Eno's spirit at all. In fact, he fell behind to talk with the ones he enjoyed the most. "I'm going to drink all the water," Garcia exclaimed. "Not if I do first," replied Eno. "You may drink after I have cleansed my skin," said Rala, smiling with her strange head of straight blonde hair. They had found Rala wandering aimlessly from the south. Her people were some of the fools that stayed in one place, putting together dens of wood and claiming them as their own. Her hides were also different. Unlike everyone else's bland brown leather, hers was made from the skins of a colorful spotted creature. The tail was still attached and danced back and forth invitingly when she walked, which made Eno and the other young men purposely walk behind her from time to time. Perhaps the strangest thing of all was the slope in her forehead was practically non-existent, incredibly smooth. She was a perfect female specimen, and everyone sought to mate with her. She wouldn't, of course, claiming not one of them was in her heart. No one quite knew what this meant, and while it frustrated some, everyone decided they would wait until their journey was over to claim her. As the day went on, the sun began to dip and they approached the small waterfall. Eno joined the group of men that went forward, scouting for anything that could be perceived as a threat. Though there was none, he did his best to look fearsome and strong, constantly overdoing his movements to flex his young muscles. This made Rala laugh, and she laughed even harder when Garcia crept up behind him and let out his best eagle screech, flapping his arms as if they were wings as Eno jumped and bounded into him. Eno raised his spear blunt end first and thrust it into Garcia, which he grabbed with his armpit and mocked a dying eagle scream, before crashing to the ground in an impressive aerial display. Rala laughed and cheered with enthusiasm, as did a few other members who watched on. Bron shook his head in displeasure at the silly events before him. "Would you be laughing if a leopard made you his meal?" he asked sternly, smacking him upside the head. "Get with the rest of the men, you're going hunting. If you play your games and get someone hurt, I will hold you responsible," he said coldly, and walked away. Eno reached down and helped Garcia up, after making a face at his father, and the two made their way over to the others who gathered to the nearby grass plain. The plan was to fan out in separate directions. Half of the men would scare the prey over to the other half, where Eno and Garcia would be waiting with their weapons, ready to strike. The grass was tall and the wind blew towards them. Everything was in their favor. "I can't wait to mate with Rala. She will make wonderful children," Garcia whispered as they crouched. "You'll have to wait until I'm finished. I think I will take her tonight," Eno replied. "She wouldn't mate with you. You have no bravery." "I am the leader's son. I don't need bravery. Plus, I'm braver than you. You've never even seen a Wara," hissed Eno. "I could kill the Wara all by myself, and if one came for my mother, she would still be with us," he said, chuckling. "I'll feed you to the Wara myself," he said, giving him a hard shove. Garcia pushed him back, and before they knew, there was a rustling coming from the grass in front of them. They turned their heads just in time to see a large boar emerge, but before they could grab their spears, it ran off past them. Their moment was gone. "Eno, Garcia, are you both as dumb as you are loud?" cried one of the hunters, coming from the same direction as the boar. "It's his fault," cried Garsha as he stood up and pointed. "He shoved me for no reason." "Yes, it is his fault. However, it is your fault as well. I could hear both of you squabbling from across the field. I'm sure we can find more food, but it won't be that boar we handed to you. And it won't be with you two either. Go back to the women," he yelled. The other hunters rose from their spots, all giving them dour looks. "Stupid," Eno yelled and walked off. Garsha ran up behind him and put a hand on his back, which was quickly shrugged off. "Hey, stop being angry. When we get back, I'll let you have half of my rations." As upset as Eno was, he felt his taut stomach growl at the mention of food. It had been a long day, and he was tired and hungry. Still, he said nothing, and for most of the way, nothing else was said. "I'll let you mate with Rala first," he said with a grin. "Yes, you will, but you'll have to wait for a few days," Eno fired back, and they both laughed at this. They made it back and found Rala by the fire, where small lizards were being cooked on sticks. The other women were gathering around her as she told the end of the story of how she got her skins. "I finally found the animal that had been killing my father's pigs. It was a large cat that none of us had ever seen before, like a panther, but larger. It roared as I cornered it, and when it bounced towards me, I threw the rock down on top of its head. I felt its claws touch my skin, ready to cut my flesh, as it finally died. I skinned it and tanned it myself," she said proudly, showing off the orange and black spotted fur. Everyone clamored around her, reaching to feel the exotic fur, and praised her amazing feat. She smiled over at the boys and came over to meet them. "How was the hunt?" "We'd come back with a pig if the great eagle over here would shut his mouth," said Eno. "That boar would have torn you apart. You're just lucky I was there to save you," he replied. "Are you sure you both aren't just terrible hunters?" Rala said with a giggle. Both of them looked to her to give a reply, but seeing her special cat furs, they thought better of it. Eno, Garsha, and Rala all made a break for the water, removing their clothes before they were even halfway there and jumping in. The water shocked Eno, and he let out a high yell as he relished the feeling. Garsha came up and began splashing water into Eno's face as he struggled to keep his messy hair out of his eyes. So he swam back under. Roughly pulling Garsha back under, the two began to wrestle, keeping each other under as long as they could. When they came back up, they saw Rala sitting on the rock of the water was pouring down onto. Her hair was wet, covered her large breasts, and the two were stunned. Eno felt something in his chest that was more than an urge to mate, although he definitely felt that too. He found he couldn't think of anything else but Rala. And like a torrent of a storm, the emotions quickly filled his heart, and apparently Garsha noticed her too, because he made his way over to the rock. He continued to climb up and grabbed her arms, hard in his grip. Eno felt something else at that moment. A hot flash of anger came over him. He was forcing himself on top of her despite her not being in heat. This was normal in their group. Numbers could always get lower, and making children was rarely declined. However, Eno couldn't let it happen. He swam over as hard as he could and was now behind Garsha. He grabbed the back of his neck and squeezed hard. With a loud roar, he threw him into the water. Garsha's head smacked onto a rock on the way down. Garsha reemerged with red liquid pouring out of his wound and screamed back in a threatening manner. Eno opened his arms and put himself in front of her, returning an angry roar of his own. Garsha reluctantly swam back to shore, his dark eyes fixed on Eno, and Eno noticed others gazed upon him as well. eyes wide in surprise. He took hold of Rala's hand and pulled her to the other side of the river, around the rocks. He could hear angry shouts from behind as his former friend was shouting threats of feeding him to the Wara. Once they were far enough away, they sat, naked with their backs against a warm rock. "Why did you do that?" she asked in confusion. Eno sat in silence for a moment, considering the question to himself. Why did he do that? Certainly a woman was fair game for anyone. Something inside him had changed somehow. "I couldn't watch him mate with you. I want you for me," he said, gazing at her face. Her eyes met his, brows furrowed sharply as she thought deeply about the incident. "You want me?" she asked, her eyes opening wide and her smooth skin darkening as she blushed. Eno nodded without taking his eyes from hers. He leaned in and put his large hand on hers. "You are mine," he said sternly, and before he knew what he was doing, their lips pressed against each other. The concept of a kiss was new, and he felt his stomach drop out from under him. He no longer had to wonder what it felt like to be a bird and fly through the air. Their breath was heavy, and they mated right then and there. As the eventide slowly turned into night, the two lay next to each other in each other's arms. His fingers traced the soft warmth of her face as he stared into her eyes. It was as if she had become the very air to him. Survival had become the second reason for living. From that moment on, the two were inseparable and would sleep next to each other. When the nightmares would come, he would see his mother being taken, and he would try and fail to help her. Rala would wake up to his muffled cries and pull him close, telling him it was all right. He never knew such relief before. And they would kiss, knowing a happiness they never knew existed. The spot they were in was deemed one of the safer places to stay, and they all rested for about 5 days. There was singing and stories. The children laughed and played without a care in the world, and the adults smiled at this. So rare was the opportunity. The reality of their world came crashing in around them, however, on the 5th night. The fire was low, and most of the group was asleep on their hide mats and were gathered around a curving face in a small mountain. They always had people standing watch, but seeing no reason for alarm, the past 4 nights it was lax, and the 5 men that were supposed to be paying attention were talking amongst themselves. "Hush," said one of the men. The others went silent, and they listened to the tall, dry grass blowing in the wind. Suddenly there was a high-pitched cry in the distance, what was followed by another, and before they knew it, the sounds of them were surrounding them. "Get up!" he yelled. Him and the other 4 gathered their spears, and running to rouse the group that began sitting up in panic. Eno, who now slept next to Rala, got up in a hurry, looking around at the excitement around him. From the grass, large figures began to emerge. They looked like wolves, but not any that he had seen before. They were skinnier and much larger. Their cries were strange to him as well, coming out as a high-pitched cackle. They ran towards the group, and normally the women and children would begin to run away, but there was nowhere to go. They were surrounded. Eno ran over to the woodpile and picked up a large wooden club. The men that were able-bodied took weapons themselves and got ready to fight for their very existence. The creatures yipped and called to them as they paced back and forth. It unsettled Eno that there was no growl. What were these creatures? He didn't have much time to ponder, as the first 2 came from the right. One hunter sunk his spear into the first creature's ribs, but the second was on top of him and began to tear off a large section of his arm. 4 of the other creatures ran in that direction. A few joined in to feast upon the still screaming man, and the others swarmed the next closest. "Get across the river," yelled Bron. The women holding the young made their way over, leaving everything else behind. It was a mess as those who couldn't swim were desperately gripping onto the others. Everyone was in a panic, and even the men trying to hold the line were abandoning their positions. A good number of the creatures made their way over with their hellish yips, and those that didn't eat the dead were now attacking anyone they could sink their teeth into. Eno ran over to the now smoldering fire and dipped his club into the sack of cooking fat. He jammed it into the coals, and at once they became alight. The beasts that were now making their way to him had second thoughts as they eyed the flame before them. The situation was looking hopeless, and that's when a familiar roar tore through the camp. From the same direction the wolf-like beasts had come, a massive dark shape could be seen. The tall grass did little to cover it, and it made no effort to conceal itself. The creatures all turned at this, and they all yelped to each other. A few ran out into the field to meet the dark shape. A low growl, followed by another roar that seemed to shake the land itself, erupted. After a few high-pitched cries, there was only silence. The pack of creatures seemed to stop and consider their odds, and then fled. The sound of meat and bone could be heard, tearing sickly from one another as the mass consumed its kill. The sounds of bones crunching between powerful jaws resounded as the first cry came. "Wara!" came a woman's voice from across the river, and more screams erupted. People were trampled, and bodies, both large and small, were left to float down the slow-moving river. Eno found Rala in the scuffle, and the two made their way to the river. Despite the mass of tangled people, they were able to make it across. Eno looked back and saw his father limping to the water. "Go!" Bron yelled, seeing his son's indecision. He almost did, but something stopped him in his tracks, and before he knew what he was doing, he was jumping back into the water. He swam as hard as he could and grabbed his father, pulling him in. The large black shape of the Wara moved closer. Its ever-imposing grunts echoed through the area as it began to feast on the ones who weren't able to make it. "You idiot, just leave me," Bron yelled in his ear, as Eno struggled to swim back to the other side with his father on his back. Mostly everyone that was still alive was still running, leaving only Rala to grab hold and help pull them to the other side of the bank. They both coughed out water that had been found its way to their windpipe, and when Bron stood, it was clear he had injured his leg. They made their way as quickly as possible across the barren fields that lay before them. Once there was a good distance away, they stopped. The Wara wouldn't follow them. It had plenty to eat. Bron caught his breath and reeled back and hit Eno with a fist solid enough to knock him down. Rala screamed, going to his side. "I told you to leave me. You may have killed yourself or others." "You really wanted to die that badly?" shot back Rala. "This is your fault. I've grown tired of your presence, girl. I think it's time for you to leave." "Father, no. She is a weakness for our people. Look at how many are dead. She has control over you, boy, and if you want to stay with us and alive, you will leave her here," he screamed, his eyes bloodshot and teeth bare. Eno closed his eyes. He knew his father was right and could not go against him. "Go," he uttered. "What?" she said, standing up, eyes heavy with tears. "I said go." "You're nothing but a burden on us," Eno yelled with a sharp gaze. "But I'm yours," she whispered. "You are not mine. You are anyone's who will take you." Rala took a few steps back, her eyes full of pain and disbelief. Without another word, she ran off towards the other face of the mountain and disappeared into the dark. Eno went to help his injured father, but he smacked his hand away and walked towards the group that was waiting for them. He hid his pain well and no one questioned his fitness to lead. The next day went by without incident. There were many people lost the previous night. Several women, 3 men, and 5 children. There was little talking and a feeling of soberness cast amongst them. He tried as hard as he could, but his mind would always go back to Rala. It felt like his heart had been stabbed with a spear and nothing could help. The night wasn't any better. It was much colder without her body close to his, and when he went to sleep, he saw the Wara again. However, instead of his mother's face being pulled away, it was Rala, with her blonde hair and accusatory stare. Her scream echoed through his mind, and he woke up with it on his own lips. The others were quickly roused and went into action as though another predator were upon them. They saw nothing in the night, and all was quiet. Bron went to his son. "Why do you draw every living thing to our people?" he said in a low, growling tone. "Rala, she needs me." "I need her," he said with pain in his eyes as he took his spear from the ground. "No, you need to sleep. We have a long walk ahead still, and you are—" "I can't be without her, father. She is a part of me. She is my heart," he said, baring his teeth. Bron stared at his son for a time. "If you go back, you will be left. Not one person will come for you," he said coldly. "Good. I don't care anymore. Without her, I can't breathe," he said, holding his head as tears fell freely to the ground. He turned and ran off into the night. Bron yelled his son's name one last time. Eno didn't sleep that night. He ran as hard as his feet and lungs would allow, praying to any spirit that would listen that she was still all right. Of course, he took breaks now and then, but only when he absolutely had to. And even then he waited as the seconds drifted by, his face growing longer by the day. He finally reached the mountain where the waterfall was. Looking around, he saw the remains of people's stuff. They left in a hurry. However, there was not one body. Even the blood in the dirt had been greedily lapped up. The enormous paw marks from the Wara were easy to find, and he could make out that it merely walked across the rock in the waterfall with no more trouble than if it were a puddle. He also saw that they curved around the mountain to its other face. Desperation tore at his soul, and he knew it was going the way she had gone. "Hold on just a little bit longer," he said to himself as he began running towards Rala and towards the Wara. The grass was turning to rock, and he was quickly losing the monster's tracks. "Rala!" he screamed again and again. His hope was turning into despair. He walked on until the sun once again began to go down. In the distance there was a forest, and having no better option, he walked on. The ground changed as he got closer, and when finally found claw marks in the dirt, they were so large, if he were to lie down in one, it could have easily enveloped his body. There was no question that it was the monster that took his mother. He followed them towards the jungle, and once inside the brush, he found another sign. There was blood. He looked around, and a fear so wicked and cold shook through his body. "Rala!" he screamed again. When he calmed down, he discovered a blood-covered skull. Most of the skin and meat had been torn away, revealing the grin of death, eyeballs still glistening in their wet sockets. He let out a breath of relief. It was only a grazing animal. He also discovered another set of footprints leading away. She was running. He continued on, knowing full well the Wara was near, and yelling would surely mean his end. He didn't care anymore. He only wanted her. He needed to know she was okay. He continued around a bend to a clearing where a large mass of rock shot up into the sky. They weren't quite mountains, but they were made of stone and covered with vegetation. Eno could no longer make out her tracks, but he needed a break. He sat down and put the spear next to him. The sounds of the jungle nightlife were around him. Insects and strange birds chirped, and the peacefulness washed over him like rain. His eyes closed, and he saw his mother smiling and laughing, throwing him in the air to catch him as he came down. He found he wished she was still with him, and enjoyed seeing her once more. Then that horrible, low growl echoed out. Her face turned into one of fear as the growl turned into a mighty roar. He jumped up, holding the spear ready to defend his mother, but she was gone. It was dark and he was in the forest by himself. The noise was real, and it was at the tree line of the clearing. Through the dark, he could make out 2 pinpricks of light reflecting off the eyes of the beast. Everything else was hidden. He slowly got to his feet, pressing his back to the wall of the towering stone structure. His hand felt around it and came across a ledge. In a blur of motion, the great Wara came crashing through the forest towards him, its dark mass frame coming into view as it trampled brush and knocked down trees. Eno turned around and climbed up the stone. He was quick, but just as he thought he was safe, he felt the tip of a sharp claw catch his thigh and tear through it with ease. He screamed and climbed as fast as he could, and when he was almost to the top, he looked down and saw the creature standing on its hind legs. It was as tall as 2 men, and its massive body had the arms and legs the size of tree trunks. The head was the worst part, though. From its dark eyes, he could see the hatred that burned off behind them as its huge, snouted mouth opened up to the point he could easily bite and eat his head all at once, and the amount of thick, frothy drool it dripped from its jowls, it would have too. It raked its claws against the stone in a vain attempt to reach Eno, but he was safe for now. He continued to the top and sat, setting the useless spear to his side, and let out a sigh. He stared into the night, looking at the bright dots in the sky, and found himself sadly thinking of Rala. His heart burned for her in a way he had never felt before, and it was almost agonizing as his leg. He looked at it, feeling utterly defeated. It wasn't a very deep cut, but it was long, and blood continued to trickle out of it. He knew if he didn't get it treated, he would most likely die. But the best he had, unfortunately, was some moss that grew on the side of the stone. He pressed it against it for as long as he could, until he finally passed out. He awoke before the sun came up to a strange sound. A light voice was calling his name from out of the darkness. "Mother?" he thought, mouthing the word, wondering if he'd already died and was now in the afterlife. He raised his head and winced at the pain as the sticky cut on his leg cracked open again, causing it to bleed once more. "Eno!" he heard again, in a sharp whisper. He looked around and noticed a shape on the stone tower across from him, some distance away. "Rala!" he yelled. His heart was filled with happiness and relief. "Quiet!" she whispered back. In the fading darkness, he could see her arm pointing to the now sleeping Wara. It lay on the ground between them, snoring away. It looked dead to the world, and he figured she was thinking that this was the best time to escape. She was right, he thought, as she began to climb down her spire. Eno began to do the same, and he saw her drop down safely and began to move around it and under Eno. He almost reached the bottom when a loud roar broke the silence. The Wara was awake, and it was bounding after Rala. She screamed and ran as fast as she could, but she wasn't nearly fast enough. It would be on her in no time. Just when he thought it was over, he heard a male scream, and from the right, someone slammed hard into the beast, driving a spear into its side. The great bear grappled with him in its great paws and ripped a large chunk of bone and meat from his shoulder. Eno's heart stopped, and he felt his eyes grow hot with tears. It was his father. He had come back for Eno. His heart raged with many different feelings. Some he knew, some that were completely alien. And they all came out at once as he let out a great cry, jumping off the structure and driving his spear into the beast with all of his might. The tip sank into its neck and it growled, became wet, and bubbled out. The paws of the monster tried to reach behind its back to take Eno, but they couldn't reach, and slowly the struggles of the beast were weakened. It let out a few final rattles of death and lay still. Eno got up and pulled the spear out with great effort and stabbed the dead Wara again and again, screaming and crying the entire time. After a time, he finally felt hands upon his shoulders from behind. It was Rala, and she was crying as well. He let go of the weapon and walked over to where his father lay. Eno dumbly dropped to his knees and took hold of Braun's hand. It gripped back weakly as the look of pain turned to a smile. His eyes closed and he crumpled. Broken body lay motionless next to the beast. After more time of silence and tears, Eno looked to Rala. I was bad to you. I left you for dead, but I know I need you, he said, tears still streaming down his cheeks. Rala simply looked at him and smiled, her hand running through his hair. Mine, she simply replied. So quoth this raven. This was a different story, but I hope you enjoyed it. I have two thoughts on this. One is, most animals, when they lose their fur, look absolutely adorable. Except bears. Then they look like demons straight out of hell. And the second thought I have on this is something that became popular about 9 months ago, the beginning of the pandemic. Years ago, the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead was asked by a student what she considered to be the first sign of civilization in a culture. The student expected her to talk about fish hooks or clay pots or grinding stones, but she said that the first sign was a thigh bone that had been broken and healed. She explained that in nature, if you break your leg, you die. You can't run, you can't get food or water. So you're basically prey. A broken femur that had healed is evidence that someone had taken time to care for the fallen person, that had bound the wound and carried them and cared for them and made sure they had food and water. And so caring for someone, physically and emotionally, is where civilization starts. And we're best when we care for each other. That's being civilized. So thank you, Paul, for the wonderful story, and I hope you all enjoyed it, and I all hope you have an absolutely marvelous Tuesday. Love you, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.